My family forgot me after my wife died. I cooked, called, and waited 13 years. Not one person showed up, so I sold the house, closed all my accounts, and vanished. 6 months later, I received a call that would make me realize they never saw me as a father, only as a piggy bank waiting to be cracked open. Before I tell you the rest of this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect should be earned, not inherited. My name is Will Gallagher. I am 70 years old, and for my entire adult life I believed that a man's greatest legacy was the family he leaves behind. I spent decades building a logistics firm from a single rusted delivery truck into a multi-state operation. It was grueling, back-breaking work that kept me away from home more nights than I care to admit. When I finally sold the company 20 years ago, the buyout was staggering. It was the kind of wealth that changes generations. But my wife Martha and I made a quiet, ironclad agreement. We locked that fortune away in blind trusts, index funds, and secure offshore accounts. We stayed in our modest 4-bedroom brick house in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Ohio. We kept driving our practical 5-year-old sedans, and we continued buying our clothes off the clearance racks. Why would we hide such success? Because we had 2 sons, Matthew and Bradley. We looked around at the children of our newly wealthy peers and saw nothing but entitlement, laziness, and moral decay. We wanted our boys to understand the heavy value of a dollar earned through genuine sweat. We wanted them to build their own lives without waiting for a golden handout. We provided them with excellent educations, paying their college tuitions in full, but we let them believe we were just a comfortable, strictly middle-class family living on a fixed pension. I thought I was teaching them character and resilience. I did not realize I was only teaching them how to bide their time and wait for the old man to fade away. Today was supposed to be a monumental milestone. It was my 70th birthday. More importantly, and far more heavily on my heart, it marked exactly 13 years to the day since my beautiful Martha lost her battle with illness and passed away. In our family, her passing had essentially frozen time, or at least it had for me. For the past 3 days, I had been meticulously preparing for a massive family dinner to honor both occasions. I went to the local butcher and bought the most expensive cut of prime rib, marinating it just the way Matthew used to love when he was a growing teenager. I spent hours baking the rich double chocolate cake from scratch that Bradley always demanded for his own childhood birthdays. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, scrubbing the baseboards, polishing the hardwood floors until they gleamed, and carefully setting the long dining room table with Martha's favorite delicate porcelain plates. I imagined the house finally filling with the chaotic, joyful sounds of my grandchildren running down the halls. I imagined the clinking of silverware, the warmth of shared memories, and the comfort of knowing that even without Martha, our family remained united. I put on my absolute best suit, a dark navy 2-piece that Martha had always complimented, and I sat in my armchair in the living room waiting for the doorbell to ring. 5 o'clock came and went. Then 6 o'clock passed in absolute silence. By 7 o'clock, the street lamps flickered on outside my window, casting long, lonely shadows across my driveway. I stared at the antique grandfather clock ticking away on the wall, each rhythmic swing of the pendulum sounding like a hammer striking the nails into an empty coffin. By 8 o'clock, the silence in the house had become entirely suffocating. The rich smell of roasted meat and sweet vanilla filled a home that felt entirely dead. I picked up my phone, staring at the blank screen. There were no missed calls. There were no text messages. There was not a single digital whisper to acknowledge that the man who raised them, clothed them, and educated them was turning 70, or that the woman who gave them life had been gone for 13 long years. My hands began to shake, not from age, but from a rising, panicked desperation. I dialed Matthew's number first. It rang twice before going straight to his casual, dismissive voicemail. I dialed Bradley next. It rang 4 times before the automated carrier voice kicked in. I sat there in the dimming evening light, surrounded by a feast meant for a dozen people, completely and utterly alone. Slowly, the devastating realization washed over me. It was not that they were unexpectedly busy. It was not that there was a sudden emergency. It was that they simply did not care. To them, I was just the tedious old man waiting in the house they would eventually inherit. I walked into the dining room, the pristine, untouched table mocking my foolish optimism. With hands that suddenly stopped trembling and grew incredibly steady, I picked up the heavy roasting pan containing the prime rib. I carried it to the kitchen and dropped the expensive meat straight into the garbage bin. I marched back for the cake. Into the trash it went. Plate by plate, bowl by bowl, I scraped the elaborate, painstakingly prepared dinner into the refuse. It felt like I was throwing away the last remnants of my naive paternal love. As I forcefully pushed the garbage down to make room, my hand brushed against a crumpled envelope resting near the edge of the counter. It was a piece of mail that had been misdelivered to my address a few days prior, bearing Matthew's name. I had intended to hand it to him tonight over dinner. But something about the stark official font of the commercial bank logo caught my eye. My moral compass, the one that had always respected my adult children's privacy, completely evaporated in the heat of my betrayal. I tore the thick envelope open. It was a formal notice from a high-stakes commercial lending institution. As my eyes rapidly scanned the dense black and white text, the blood practically froze in my veins. Matthew was attempting to secure a massive high-risk business loan to salvage his failing ventures, and the collateral listed on the application, my house, the very house I was standing in. He had submitted fraudulent preliminary documents, attempting to leverage my property banking on the arrogant assumption that his senile, aging father would never notice the fine print, or perhaps hoping I would simply drop dead before the bank ever called in the massive debt. He was trying to secretly mortgage the roof over my head. The profound, paralyzing heartbreak that I had been suffering through for the past 4 hours instantly vanished. It was entirely replaced by a cold, clinical, and terrifying resolve that I had not felt since my days of ruthlessly dismantling corporate logistics competitors. They did not see me as a father. They never had. They saw me as a blind, waiting asset, a pathetic piggy bank that had severely outlived its usefulness. In that singular moment of absolute clarity, standing in a kitchen, smelling of wasted food and shattered illusions, I made a final decision. If I was nothing more than a ghost to them, then a ghost I would become. I decided right then and there to completely and systematically erase my existence from their lives. The very next morning, I made a phone call that I had hoped I would never have to make regarding my own flesh and blood. I called Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan is not the kind of lawyer you hire to draft a simple will or dispute a parking ticket. He is a high-tier wealth management attorney, a shark in a tailored suit who operates entirely in the shadows. We met over 30 years ago when my logistics firm was aggressively expanding across state lines. I needed someone ruthless to navigate the corporate predators trying to swallow my company whole, and Jonathan proved to be exceptionally lethal in a courtroom. He was the man who meticulously built the legal fortresses around my assets. For decades, he quietly managed my multi-million-dollar portfolio, ensuring that my wealth remained completely invisible to the public and, more importantly, invisible to my own family. He knew exactly how much I was worth down to the final cent. When I calmly explained to Jonathan what Matthew was attempting to do with the fraudulent commercial loan, his response was immediate and chillingly precise. He asked me exactly how far I wanted to go to teach them a lesson. I told him I wanted to become a ghost. Jonathan moved with a terrifying efficiency that reminded me of my own competitive corporate days. He completely bypassed the traditional real estate market. There would be no open houses, no cheerful real estate agents, no wooden for sale signs planted in the front yard, and absolutely no local gossip for my sons to catch wind of. Within 48 hours, Jonathan connected me with a massive corporate commercial developer looking to aggressively acquire suburban land for a future retail project. They wanted the valuable lot my house sat on, not the sentimental memories inside the walls. They were willing to pay well above market value in pure cash just to secure the property quickly. I signed a strict non-disclosure agreement, barring the developers from publicly announcing the acquisition until the physical demolition phase began. In exactly 2 weeks, they wired the full cash value of the property directly into one of my secure offshore trusts. The speed of the transaction was absolutely breathtaking. I was legally selling 40 years of my life, the very foundation where Martha and I raised our boys, and I felt absolutely nothing but overwhelming relief. The trap was officially set. Next came the meticulous financial cleansing. I drove to my local bank branch, the familiar brick building where the tellers knew me by my first name and always asked about my health. I smiled politely as I closed every single local checking and savings account I held there. I requested the remaining balances in cashier checks and immediately transferred those funds into the blind trusts that Jonathan controlled from afar. I walked out of that bank knowing I had effectively severed my final visible financial tie to the state of Ohio. Then I went back to the empty, echoing house to pack. I stood in the center of the living room and looked around at the heavy oak furniture, the antique grandfather clock, the expensive porcelain plates that my sons never appreciated. I left it all exactly where it stood. I took only a single leather suitcase. Inside, I packed some practical clothes, my essential legal documents, and a small framed photograph of Martha taken on our 25th anniversary. Everything else, the physical artifacts of a family that no longer respected me, I abandoned to the developers' waiting bulldozers. I took my everyday cell phone, the one my sons had comfortably ignored for 13 agonizing years, and I dropped it into a full pitcher of water in the kitchen sink. I watched the screen short out, flicker, and die. The total silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had heard in over a decade. I carried my single suitcase out to my car. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale golden light over the neighborhood I had called home for 4 decades. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I did not shed a single tear for the boys I was leaving behind. I merged onto the interstate and pointed my car south, driving 1,000 miles away from the deception and the bitter betrayal. I drove for 2 straight days, watching the landscape shift from gray suburban sprawl to vibrant green palms and the salty, humid smell of the ocean. With every single mile marker I passed, I felt a heavy, suffocating layer of obligation peeling off my shoulders. I was shedding my old skin and leaving the naive, devoted father buried in the dust. I relocated to an exclusive, highly secured, gated coastal community located 1,000 miles away from the wreckage of my old life. It was a place purposefully designed for absolute privacy, where wealth spoke in polite whispers and neighbors deeply respected each other's boundaries. There were biometric security gates and armed guards patrolling the private beach access. Jonathan had arranged a beautiful beachfront condominium under a corporate shell company, ensuring my true name appeared on absolutely no public property records. For the first time in my entire life, I woke up every morning to the sound of crashing ocean waves instead of the crushing weight of familial expectations. 6 months passed in absolute serene silence. I walked the quiet white sand beach every morning while the tide rolled in. I read thick historical books on my sunlit balcony. I drank expensive coffee and simply existed. I finally learned how to breathe again. The constant nagging anxiety of waiting for my sons to finally care about me simply evaporated in the warm ocean breeze. I was healing. The deep psychological wounds inflicted by their cruel neglect were slowly turning into faded, painless scars. I felt a profound peace knowing Martha would have wanted me to spend my final years surrounded by breathtaking beauty instead of begging for scraps of attention from ungrateful, selfish men. But true peace is rarely permanent when dealing with greedy people. Jonathan had given me a highly encrypted burner phone before I left Ohio. It was an emergency-only device programmed to route calls through multiple secure international servers, and it would only ring if Jonathan himself authorized the connection to protect my location. He explicitly told me to keep it charged and hidden, warning me that a man cannot vanish completely without causing a serious tremor eventually. For 6 solid months, that thick black plastic phone sat silently in the bottom drawer of my bedside table, gathering dust. I had almost forgotten it existed in my new paradise. Then, on a quiet Tuesday evening, while I was watching a magnificent sunset paint the coastal sky in shades of brilliant orange, the silence was violently shattered. The burner phone began to ring. The sound was sharp and invasive, cutting through the tranquility of my new life like a blaring siren. I froze, my heart skipping a painful beat in my chest. I walked slowly from the balcony into the bedroom, pulled open the heavy wooden drawer, and stared down at the glowing screen. There was no caller ID, just a long string of encrypted numbers pulsing in the dim light. I picked up the heavy device and brought it to my ear, pressing the answer button. I did not speak. I simply stood in the shadows and waited. For a terrible second, there was only the sound of ragged, hyperventilating breaths on the other end of the line. It sounded like someone was actively drowning in pure, unadulterated panic. Then a frantic, terrified voice broke through the digital static, screaming into the receiver. It was Matthew. The voice on the other end of the line was weeping with the pathetic, wet gasps of a cornered animal. It was Matthew, my oldest boy. Growing up, Matthew had always been the golden child, the handsome athlete who never quite had to face the music when things went wrong. If he broke a neighbor's window playing baseball, his mother paid for it before the neighbor could complain. If he failed an exam, he charmed his way into extra credit. He lived his entire life believing the universe was a padded room designed specifically to catch his falls. That reckless entitlement only multiplied when he married Valerie. Valerie was a woman whose blood ran pure status. Her entire existence was wrapped up in country club memberships, luxury SUVs leased well beyond their means, and maintaining a flawless, wealthy facade for her social circle. She was the kind of woman who treated service workers like dirt and demanded the world bow to her aesthetic. But Matthew was not calling me after 6 months of absolute silence because he missed his father. He was not calling to apologize for missing my 70th birthday, nor was he calling to ask about my health. He was calling in a state of sheer, unadulterated terror. "Dad, is that you? Please tell me that is you." He choked out, his voice cracking violently. I did not answer. I simply stood on my balcony, feeling the warm coastal breeze against my face, listening to the chaotic background noise filtering through the phone's speaker. Beneath Matthew's frantic breathing, I could hear the unmistakable heavy roar of industrial diesel engines. I heard the sharp, violent crunch of splintering wood and the shattering of glass. The corporate developers had arrived. "Dad, you have to stop them," Matthew screamed over the sound of an excavator tearing into the front porch of his childhood home. "You have to call the development company right now and cancel the sale. Tell them it is a mistake. Tell them you changed your mind. You cannot sell the house." I leaned against the railing and watched the ocean waves roll onto the white sand. "Why would I stop them, Matthew?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm, devoid of any warmth or paternal instinct. "I sold that property for cash. I do not live there anymore. It is not my problem." The absolute coldness of my tone seemed to shatter whatever composure he had left. He began to hyperventilate, the panic stripping away decades of his arrogant golden boy persona. "Dad, you do not understand what you have done," he sobbed. "The bank called me this morning. They froze all of my accounts. They told me the title of your property was transferred to a corporate entity. And why would my real estate transaction concern your personal bank accounts?" I asked, deliberately forcing him to verbally confess to the trap I already knew he was caught in. The silence on the line was heavy, thick with shame and desperation. The sound of a bulldozer crushing the roof of our old garage filled the gap. "I took out a loan," Matthew finally whispered, his voice trembling with cowardice. "My business was going under. Valerie was threatening to take the kids and leave me if we lost the country club membership and the cars. I was drowning, Dad. I needed cash immediately. I took out a $300,000 commercial line of credit. And what did you use for collateral? Matthew? I pressed, my voice dropping an octave, demanding the ugly truth. I used your house, he wept. I used the house. My name is the only name on that deed, I replied smoothly. How exactly did you leverage a property you do not own? I forged your signature, he wailed, completely breaking down. I forged your signature on the loan documents, and I paid a shady notary to stamp it. I thought you were just going to live in that house forever. I thought I would have years to pay it back before you passed away, and the estate went into probate. I never thought you would just pack up and sell it to a commercial developer out of nowhere. He had bet his entire freedom on the assumption that I would simply sit in that empty suburban house and wait to die. But because Jonathan Pierce had bypassed the traditional real estate market and executed a silent cash-only corporate sale, the bank holding Matthew's fraudulent loan was automatically notified of the title transfer. The sudden sale had triggered an immediate audit. The bank's fraud department had pulled the original deed transfer and instantly realized the signature on the sale documents did not match the forged signature on Matthew's commercial loan. Dad, they are calling the loan in. Matthew screamed the reality of his impending doom fully settling in. They are demanding immediate repayment of the $300,000 in full by Friday. If the funds are not cleared, the bank's fraud division is submitting a brief to the district attorney. I am facing federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. I will go to federal prison, Dad. Valerie will divorce me. I will lose everything. You have to wire me the money right now, or you have to contact the bank and sign a retroactive authorization swearing you gave me permission to take out that loan. You have to save me. I stood there holding the encrypted phone, looking out at the endless horizon of the ocean. A father is supposed to feel a biological imperative to protect his child from harm. But as I listened to the pathetic begging of a man who had ignored me for 13 years, a man who had stolen my identity and mortgaged my memories, just to keep his shallow, materialistic wife dressed in designer clothes, I felt absolutely nothing. The love I once held for him had been thrown into the garbage along with that untouched birthday dinner 6 months ago. You made a choice, Matthew, I said softly, my voice slicing through his hysteria with surgical precision. For 13 years, you forgot that I existed. You let me sit alone in that house waiting for a phone call that never came. You only remembered my name when you needed to forge it on a bank document. Dad, please, I am begging you, he cried. I am not your father anymore, I continued, entirely unmoved. I am just a ghost, and ghosts cannot sign retroactive bank authorizations. Actions have consequences, Matthew. It is time you finally face yours. I pulled the phone away from my ear, ignoring his desperate screaming pleas, and I pressed the end button. I turned the device completely off, cutting the encrypted connection, and slipped it back into my pocket. I knew exactly what was happening on the other side of the country. I could picture the scene with absolute clarity. Matthew was standing on the suburban sidewalk, sweating through his expensive suit, watching the heavy machinery reduce his childhood bedroom to a pile of splintered wood and drywall. Driven by the primal terror of an impending prison sentence, he would not accept defeat. He would immediately pull out his phone and dial his younger brother, Bradley. Bradley was a different kind of monster. He was a distant, calculated opportunist married to Courtney, a woman whose emotional manipulation was a finely tuned art form. Courtney was the whisperer, the puppet master, who had convinced Bradley to stop calling me years ago because she did not want him wasting his time or their finances on an aging parent. They lived in an overpriced, heavily mortgaged townhouse, constantly searching for the next quick scheme to elevate their status. When Matthew called Bradley in a state of absolute panic, frantically explaining the forged loan, the threatened prison time, and the fact that I had vanished after selling the family home for cash, Bradley would not feel sympathy for his brother. Bradley and Courtney would only hear one specific detail. They would hear that their father, a man they assumed was living on a meager fixed pension, had just successfully executed a massive silent real estate transaction with a commercial corporate developer. Courtney's greedy, calculating eyes would immediately light up. If the old man had sold the property to a corporate buyer, without a real estate agent, he was sitting on a mountain of liquid, untraceable cash. They would not care about Matthew going to federal prison. They would only care about finding me. Matthew's desperate plea for salvation would inadvertently ignite a vicious, greedy manhunt. The two brothers, driven by sheer terror and blinding avarice, would unite for the first time in years, completely unaware that their frantic search was exactly what I was counting on. The ocean breeze felt distinctly colder the morning after I severed contact with Matthew. I was sitting on my balcony sipping black coffee when my secure phone chimed again. This time it was not a frantic son. It was a man who spoke in calm, measured tones. His name was Mitchell Cross. Back when I ran my logistics empire, I learned very quickly that success paints a target on your back. You always have blind spots. You always need someone watching the doors you forgot to lock. Mitchell Cross was a former federal agent who had traded a government badge for the lucrative world of private intelligence. I had placed him on a staggering monthly retainer before I even sold my house. His sole directive was to monitor the digital and physical ripples my disappearance would cause. I paid him to be my eyes and ears in the world I had left behind. Cross did not waste time with pleasantries. He delivered information with surgical precision. He told me that Matthew and Bradley had officially joined forces. Panic makes strange bedfellows, and my sons were united by absolute desperation. Matthew was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment for forging my signature on that commercial loan. He could not go to the police to report me missing, because opening a formal investigation would instantly expose his bank fraud to the authorities. Instead, the brothers pooled whatever meager cash they could scrape together. They bypassed reputable investigators and hired a cheap, shady skip tracer who operated out of a strip mall. Cross explained exactly how the skip tracer operated. The man did not use sophisticated hacking tools or elite intelligence networks. He used cheap bribes and shady favors. He paid off a low-level municipal clerk who had access to archived state revenue records. It was a grimy, illegal tactic that exposed just how deeply my sons were willing to descend into the criminal underworld. They were crossing lines that could never be uncrossed. Matthew, who was already facing federal charges, was blindly compounding his felonies by hiring individuals who broke data privacy laws. Cross explained their objective was simple and violently desperate. They wanted to physically track me down, corner me in whatever small apartment they assumed I was renting, and refused to leave until I signed a retroactive authorization document, saving Matthew from a prison sentence. They viewed me as a stubborn old fool who just needed to be bullied into submission. It was a pathetic strategy born of arrogant entitlement. They honestly believed that if they yelled loud enough and threatened me, I would simply cave and hand over my signature like a scolded child. They thought intimidation would solve their problems because they were used to a world that always surrendered to their tantrums. But then Cross paused, and the silence over the encrypted line grew heavy. He told me the skip tracer was a bottom-feeding amateur, but even amateurs get lucky if they dig through enough garbage. The tracer had started probing my old tax records, looking for a forward address or a utility bill. He hit a dead end on my current residence, thanks to my lawyer Jonathan Pierce and his corporate shell companies. However, the tracer kept digging backward. He found a heavily redacted tax filing from 20 years ago, the exact year I sold my logistics firm. The tracer managed to breach a remarkably low-level, outdated digital firewall connected to a forgotten state tax return. It was a minuscule oversight, a tiny digital footprint left behind before Jonathan had fully fortified my portfolio. The tracer did not find my physical location, but he found something infinitely more dangerous. He stumbled upon the routing numbers and the foundational documents of my primary blind trust. Cross told me that the skip tracer had successfully downloaded a partial financial statement and handed it directly to my sons. The statement clearly outlined the exact liquid net worth of the trust, $12 million. I closed my eyes and listened to the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the shore. I could vividly imagine the exact moment my sons stared at that piece of paper. For their entire lives, they believed I was a frugal middle-class pensioner clipping coupons and agonizing over the cost of groceries. They thought my house was my only asset. Now, staring at that stolen bank summary, they realized their father was a multimillionaire. Cross described the immediate shift in their behavior based on his surveillance of their digital communications. The sheer terror of Matthew facing a prison sentence instantly evaporated. It was completely devoured by a sudden predatory and venomous greed. The narrative they spun in their own minds shifted instantaneously. Valerie, the woman who once scoffed at my outdated sedan, was suddenly planning a life of unimaginable luxury. Cross intercepted text messages where she was already browsing luxury real estate listings and pricing out private school tuitions for their children. She completely bypassed the reality that her husband was a criminal. In her eyes, the $12 million was a magic wand that would instantly erase all their sins and elevate her to the pinnacle of her social circle. Courtney was even more calculating. She immediately began researching offshore asset repatriation and the legal definitions of financial hoarding. She was building a psychological profile of me designed to convince a judge that I was an erratic miser who needed to be stripped of all financial autonomy. The wives who had constantly mocked my worn-out sweaters and simple dinners were now looking at a $12 million jackpot. They no longer saw themselves as desperate victims of a banking error. They saw themselves as heirs who had been profoundly robbed. In their twisted, entitled minds, I had stolen from them. I had forced them to live in suffocating debt while I hoarded a massive fortune in secret. Bradley, who had previously viewed Matthew's fraud as a pathetic nuisance, suddenly became a rabid participant. He was no longer trying to save his brother from jail. He was trying to secure his half of a $12 million fortune. The skip tracer had unwittingly thrown raw, bloody meat into a cage of starving wolves. Cross warned me that the situation had escalated from a frantic search into a hostile hunting expedition. The sons were no longer looking for a father to sign a piece of paper. They were hunting a target. Their communications intercepted by Cross revealed a deeply disturbing reality. They began referring to the money as their money. They discussed how to forcefully extract the funds once they found me. Courtney, the master manipulator, convinced Bradley that my disappearance and my secret wealth were clear signs of severe cognitive decline. She planted the idea that no sane parent would hide $12 million from their struggling children. It was the perfect justification for their escalating malice. They convinced themselves that they were not greedy predators, but rather righteous heirs, claiming what rightfully belonged to them. The sheer audacity of their entitlement was breathtaking. They had never worked a day in my logistics firm. They had never felt the crushing weight of securing payroll for hundreds of employees, or the sleepless nights spent navigating corporate takeovers. They had simply been born. And in their minds, that biological fact entitled them to the entirety of my life's work. I realized then that my attempt to teach them humility had failed spectacularly. The absence of wealth had not made them humble. It had only made them resentful. And now the sudden promise of absolute wealth was turning that resentment into weaponized greed. I poured myself another cup of coffee and watched a pair of seagulls fighting over a scrap of food on the beach below. It was a fitting metaphor for the sons I had left behind. They were ready to tear each other apart and destroy me in the process, all for a prize they had done absolutely nothing to earn. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, not out of fear, but out of absolute disgust. I had spent decades trying to teach them the value of hard work. I had lived a humble life to ensure they would not become spoiled and corrupted by unearned wealth. Yet the mere knowledge of the money had instantly stripped away any remaining facade of familial love. They did not care that I was gone. They did not care why I had left. They only cared about the numbers on a stolen bank statement. Mitchell Cross advised me to increase my physical security. He knew that when desperate people discover a fortune, they abandon all logic and reason. They become exceedingly dangerous. I thanked Cross for his diligent work and ended the call. I looked out over the vast expanse of the ocean, feeling a profound sense of isolation. I had wanted to vanish peacefully. I had wanted to let them live their lives while I lived mine. But the revelation of the $12 million had changed the rules of engagement. They were no longer going to let me fade away into the shadows. They were coming for the money, and they were willing to do absolutely anything to get it. The silent erasure was over. The war had officially begun, and I knew I had to prepare for a brutal confrontation. I sat on the balcony of my coastal sanctuary, watching the gray storm clouds gather over the dark water. The distant rumble of thunder felt entirely appropriate for the storm that was currently brewing back in Ohio. As I listened to the waves crash against the shore, my mind drifted back exactly 13 years to a cold, sterile room. It was the hospice care facility where my beautiful wife Martha spent her final days. The memory was etched into my brain with agonizing clarity. The rhythmic hissing of the oxygen machine, the sharp smell of antiseptic, the fragile transparency of Martha's skin as she slipped away from me. But what haunted me the most was not the illness that took her. It was the conversation I overheard in the hallway outside her door just 2 days before she died. Matthew and Bradley had stepped out to get coffee. I had followed them to ask if they wanted anything from the cafeteria. Before I could turn the corner, I heard Matthew complaining bitterly to his brother. He was not crying about losing his mother. He was complaining about the daily cost of the private hospice room. He actually stood there outside the room, where the woman who gave him life was taking her final breaths, and whined that the medical bills were going to completely drain their future inheritance. Bradley had simply nodded and agreed, suggesting they needed to speak to me about moving her to a cheaper state-run facility to protect the estate. I never confronted us about that conversation. I walked back into Martha's room, held her hand, and silently promised her I would never let those boys disrespect her memory. That memory had festered inside me for 13 years. It was the foundational bedrock of my absolute disgust for their financial entitlement. Whenever I felt a brief fleeting pang of guilt about vanishing from their lists, I simply remembered the profound callousness they displayed in that hospice hallway. They had measured their own mother's life in dollars and cents. Now they were attempting to do the exact same thing to me. My burner phone vibrated on the glass patio table. It was my attorney, Jonathan Pierce. He did not call with updates unless the situation had escalated significantly. When I answered, his voice was laced with a chilling amusement. He told me that my sons had completely abandoned their frantic attempts to cover up Matthew's forged commercial loan. The sheer terror of a federal bank fraud indictment had been entirely eclipsed by the blinding allure of a $12 million fortune. Matthew and Bradley were no longer trying to quietly fix a mistake. They had pivoted to a full hostile takeover of my entire existence. Jonathan explained that earlier that morning, my sons had marched into the county probate court and filed a fraudulent emergency petition. They were officially requesting full legal guardianship over my life and my assets. The audacity of their legal filing was staggering. Under the guidance of some sleazy local lawyer, they had signed sworn affidavits claiming that I was suffering from severe rapid onset dementia. They testified to a judge that I had wandered away from my home in a state of deep cognitive confusion. But they did not stop there. They claimed that my sudden real estate transaction was clear evidence that I was actively being exploited by unknown financial predators who had kidnapped me to steal my life savings. Their goal was ruthlessly transparent. By declaring me mentally incompetent, they sought to legally strip me of all my basic human rights. They filed an emergency motion to instantly freeze every single bank account, trust fund, and asset attached to my name. They wanted a judge to hand them the absolute power to control my $12 million, to sell my remaining properties, and to forcefully commit me to a locked psychiatric facility the moment they finally located me. In their greedy minds, this was the ultimate masterstroke. If they controlled my estate, they could quietly pay off Matthew's fraudulent bank loan, make the criminal charges disappear, and divide the remaining millions between themselves. They were attempting to weaponize the very legal system designed to protect vulnerable seniors using it as a blunt instrument of theft. But they had made one catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed I was an unprotected, naive old man without competent legal representation. They had no idea they were walking into a fortress designed by Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan described the court proceeding to me with the cold satisfaction of a predator playing with its food. When my sons and their cheap lawyer stood before the probate judge demanding the immediate freezing of my assets, they expected a simple rubber stamp approval. They believed my absence from the courtroom guaranteed their victory. Instead, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open, and local counsel representing Jonathan Pierce's elite firm walked in with a briefcase full of devastating counter-evidence. Jonathan's associates completely stonewalled my sons. They presented the judge with ironclad certified documents. These were not just standard financial disclosures. They were comprehensive neurological and psychiatric evaluations that I had proactively completed just 3 weeks before I sold my house and vanished. Top-tier medical professionals had thoroughly tested my cognitive abilities and legally certified that I was of exceptionally sound mind and in absolute control of my faculties. Furthermore, Jonathan had structured my blind trusts, utilizing complex jurisdictional firewalls. The local county judge had absolutely no legal authority to freeze assets located in offshore trusts and out-of-state corporate entities. My sons were forced to sit in silent, humiliating defeat as the judge reviewed the pristine medical evaluations. The narrative they had carefully constructed of a wandering, senile father completely collapsed. The judge realized immediately that he was being manipulated. He dismissed the emergency petition for guardianship on the spot and severely reprimanded my sons for attempting to misuse the court system. Jonathan's legal team successfully blocked the asset freeze and dismissed the guardianship claim, all without ever revealing my physical location. Matthew and Bradley walked out of that courthouse with nothing. They had no access to the $12 million. They had no legal authority over my life. And Matthew was still staring down the barrel of an impending federal bank fraud investigation regarding the forged commercial loan. They were entirely out of legal options and rapidly running out of time. But desperation is a dangerous catalyst. When arrogant people are denied what they believe they are owed, they do not simply surrender. They change their tactics. When I spoke to my private investigator, Mitchell Cross, later that evening, he confirmed my worst suspicions. My sons were panicking, turning on each other in the wake of their humiliating legal defeat. The men were crumbling under the pressure, but the women were just getting started. Cross intercepted communications proving that my daughters-in-law Valerie and Courtney had decided to take absolute control of the situation. Valerie was furious that her dreams of infinite wealth had been blocked by a judge. Courtney, the master manipulator, realized that if they could not win in a court of law, they would have to wage a war in the court of public opinion. They could not accept that an old man had outsmarted them. If the legal system would not hand them my fortune, they decided they would burn my reputation to the ground and force me out of hiding through sheer public pressure. They believed that I was hiding behind highly paid lawyers out of cowardice. They assumed that if they created a loud enough public spectacle, I would eventually break cover to defend myself. Valerie and Courtney began compiling photographs of me holding my grandchildren, playing the role of the loving, devoted patriarch. They were taking my most cherished family memories and twisting them to fit a malicious narrative. They were preparing to launch a highly coordinated, vicious public smear campaign designed to paint me as a helpless victim and my attorneys as predatory villains. The legal battle had ended, but the psychological warfare was only just beginning. I watched the storm clouds finally break over the ocean, pouring heavy rain onto the beach below. Let them come, I thought to myself. Let them scream to the world. They were about to learn that fighting a ghost is impossible, but fighting a man with nothing left to lose is absolute suicide. Valerie and Courtney were not women who understood the value of hard work, but they were absolute masters of the modern digital landscape. I should have seen this coming. 13 years ago, while I stood in the pouring rain, watching them lower my beloved Martha into the ground, My daughters-in-law were not mourning. I remember looking over and seeing Valerie adjusting her designer sunglasses, while Courtney held her phone at the perfect angle. They were taking meticulously staged photographs of themselves wiping away fake tears. For months after Martha's passing, they weaponized my wife's death on social media. They posted long, poetic tributes to the mother-in-law they barely tolerated in life, harvesting thousands of sympathy likes and comments from strangers. They used our family tragedy to boost their own social status, portraying themselves as the devastated, emotional pillars of the family, while completely ignoring the actual grieving husband sitting alone in an empty house. They understood that in today's world, perception is far more powerful than the truth. When the probate judge threw out their fraudulent guardianship petition, I knew they would not simply surrender. Denied the quiet legal theft of my $12 million, Valerie and Courtney pivoted to the battlefield they controlled best. They decided to wage a catastrophic public relations war. Mitchell Cross, my private investigator, sent me the link to a video they posted online. I sat on my quiet coastal balcony, the soothing sound of the ocean completely drowned out by the toxic, perfectly rehearsed voices of my daughters-in-law echoing from my secure phone. The production value of the video was sickeningly calculated. They sat close together on a plush beige sofa, holding hands, wearing minimal makeup and plain, modest sweaters to appear humble and devastated. Valerie looked directly into the camera with wide, tear-filled eyes, while Courtney gently wiped a perfectly timed tear from her cheek. They spun a narrative so entirely fabricated yet so emotionally compelling that it made my blood boil. They claimed that their sweet, loving grandfather, a vulnerable 70-year-old man suffering from severe, rapid-onset dementia, had been cruelly snatched away in the middle of the night. They did not mention the forged commercial loan. They did not mention the extortion. Instead, they pointed the finger directly at Jonathan Pierce. Valerie wept as she told the camera that a predatory big-city wealth management lawyer had manipulated my declining mental state. She claimed this shadowy attorney had isolated me, forced me to sell their cherished family home, and kidnapped me to drain my life savings. They painted themselves as the desperate, loving family members who were fighting against a corrupt legal system just to bring their sick, confused father home before it was too late. They begged the public for help, asking anyone with information to come forward. The video was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, and it worked flawlessly. Within 48 hours, the video had exploded across the internet. It was shared millions of times. True crime bloggers began dissecting my life. Internet sleuths started trying to dox Jonathan Pierce, leaving thousands of hateful reviews on his law firm's website. The local news stations in Ohio picked up the story, running sensationalized evening segments about the missing grandfather and the greedy corporate lawyer. The public outrage was massive, immediate, and entirely misdirected. My daughters-in-law had successfully turned a desperate criminal cash grab into a viral true crime phenomenon. For a brief moment, I admired their sheer ruthless audacity, but that admiration vanished when Mitchell Cross called me with a highly concerning update. The viral outrage had grown so loud that it had finally caught the attention of the local authorities. Specifically, it caught the eye of an ambitious, newly elected district attorney in my old Ohio county. This young prosecutor was looking for a high-profile case to build his political career, and a viral elder abuse scandal involving a wealthy, shadowy attorney was the perfect stepping stone. Cross informed me that the prosecutor had officially opened a criminal elder abuse probe. He was not just asking questions. He was preparing to issue formal, heavy-handed subpoenas against Jonathan Pierce's law firm. The prosecutor intended to pierce the corporate veil of the shell companies hiding my assets. He was demanding that Jonathan reveal my physical location, arguing that I was a vulnerable adult in imminent physical danger. The court of public opinion had handed the prosecutor the exact justification he needed to tear down the legal walls we had so carefully built. Jonathan called me shortly after Cross, his usually calm voice laced with genuine tension. He explained that while our offshore trusts and corporate entities were legally bulletproof against my sons, They could not withstand a sustained high-profile federal or state investigation fueled by massive public pressure. If the prosecutor formally ordered Jonathan to produce me, he could not simply refuse without risking severe legal sanctions and validating the family's narrative. The smear campaign was working. It was forcing our hand. I walked along the white sand beach that evening, feeling the cold ocean water wash over my bare feet. The sanctuary I had built for myself was slowly shrinking. I realized that I could no longer simply hide behind my highly paid lawyers. If I remained in the shadows, I would look exactly like the incapacitated, terrified victim my family claimed I was. If the authorities found me hiding under a corporate alias, it would only legitimize Valerie and Courtney's viral lies. I would be dragged back to Ohio, subjected to endless state-mandated psychiatric evaluations, and forced to defend my own sanity against a legal system that had already judged me in the court of public opinion. The realization was as cold and sharp as a knife. Running away was no longer an option. Ignoring them had only empowered them. I had to step out of the shadows, but I absolutely refused to be dragged out in handcuffs by a misguided prosecutor. I had to reveal myself on my own terms. I needed to prove to the authorities, the public, and the world that I was not a confused old man suffering from dementia. I needed to categorically prove my absolute mental competence on the official legal record. But simply appearing and saying I was fine would not be enough. My family would just claim that Jonathan Pierce was coaching me, that I was suffering from lucid moments between episodes of severe delusion. I needed something irrefutable. I needed my sons to demonstrate their pure, unadulterated malice right in front of the authorities. I needed to catch them in the act of treating me not as a beloved father suffering from cognitive decline, but as a financial target they were actively trying to destroy. I returned to my condominium and sat at the large glass dining table. I stared out at the dark ocean, formulating a strategy that would flip their entire smear campaign on its head. I called Jonathan and Mitchell Cross, putting them both on a secure conference line. I told them that we were no longer going to play defense. We were going to go on the offensive. I told them it was time to give my greedy sons and their manipulative wives exactly what they had been begging the internet for. I was going to give them my location. I explained my plans to my attorney and my investigator. It was a strategy born of my decades in corporate logistics, where the best way to defeat a sprawling, aggressive competitor was to let them overextend their supply lines and walk blindly into a trap. I would not emerge in Ohio to answer the prosecutor's questions. Instead, I would lure my sons out of their safe, familiar jurisdiction. I would draw them out into the open, completely separating them from their supportive local community and their carefully constructed digital audience. I instructed Cross to lay a trail of breadcrumbs, something subtle but irresistible. We needed to manufacture a digital leak that my son's hired skip tracer would easily find, pointing to a specific, highly controlled environment where I would be waiting. I was going to let them hunt me down. I was going to let them corner me. And when they finally thought they had the vulnerable, declining old man trapped with nowhere left to run, I would spring a trap so legally devastating that it would permanently shatter their viral lies and expose their profound predatory greed to the entire world. The silent erasure had failed. The loud, brutal reckoning was about to begin. The profound sadness I had felt when I first threw my untouched 70th birthday dinner into the garbage had completely evaporated. I no longer grieved for Matthew and Bradley. I no longer mourned the family I thought I had built. Watching Valerie and Courtney use Martha's memory as a prop for their social media performance had extinguished the last remaining embers of my paternal forgiveness. They wanted the world to believe I was broken, fragile, and lost. They were about to discover that the man they had ignored for 13 years was sharper, colder, and far more dangerous than they could ever possibly comprehend. I told Jonathan to prepare the legal documentation. I told Cross to prepare the surveillance. I poured myself a final cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the water, ready to invite my monsters into the light. Back when I was building my logistics company, from a single rusted truck into a nationwide delivery fleet, I learned a very specific and brutal lesson about human nature. The corporate world is absolutely full of young, aggressive executives who mistakenly believe that speed is the exact same thing as strategy. During the harsh winter of '82, when fuel shortages and union strikes were crippling the industry, I watched my competitors panic. They would see my company dominating a region and try to undercut my prices by aggressively expanding their own delivery routes to steal my clients. My board members would frequently panic, begging me to retaliate immediately to protect our territory. But I never did. I practiced tactical patience. I understood that when a greedy competitor overextends their supply lines, they burn through their fuel exhaust, their drivers, and bleed their operating capital entirely dry. I would simply sit back in absolute silence, watching them stretch themselves so thin that a single blown tire or a delayed shipment would cause their entire fragile operation to collapse. Then, when they were absolutely drowning in debt and desperate for a lifeline, I would step in and buy their ruined companies for pennies on the dollar. Patience is the ultimate weapon against arrogance. My sons, Matthew and Bradley, were operating with that exact same reckless, greedy arrogance. They were riding high on the adrenaline of their viral social media campaign, drunk on the public sympathy their wives had so carefully manufactured. But I knew their supply lines were completely stretched to the breaking point. Matthew was suffocating under the impending federal bank fraud investigation regarding the forged loan. Bradley was exhausting his own limited finances, trying to keep up with the endless legal maneuvers his manipulative wife demanded. They were desperate, running on fumes and acting entirely on frantic emotion. It was the perfect time to give them exactly what they thought they wanted. I picked up my secure phone and gave Mitchell Cross, my private investigator, the green light to set the trap. We needed to lay a digital breadcrumb so irresistible and so authentically pathetic that my sons would swallow it whole without a second thought. I instructed my wealth management attorney, Jonathan Pierce, to temporarily lift the ironclad firewall on one of my oldest and most obsolete credit cards. It was a card tied to a forgotten local bank account I had not used in over a decade. I then had Mitchell Cross travel 2 states over to a dreary mid-range highway motel in rural Kentucky. It was the exact kind of depressing, unremarkable place a confused, terrified old man would hide in if he were desperately running from his family. Cross used my old credit card to book a room at the end of the hall for an entire week. A few hours later, he used the same card to purchase a generic blood pressure monitor and some over-the-counter pain medication at a nearby roadside pharmacy. To a shady skip tracer scrubbing digital financial records. It looked exactly like an elderly man making a sloppy, desperate mistake. It painted a perfect picture of a vulnerable father, exhausted from running, settling into a cheap roadside motel to rest his weary bones. Within 12 hours, my son's hired investigators took the bait completely. Cross intercepted digital chatter confirming that Matthew and Bradley had received the motel address and were furiously mobilizing to hunt me down. While they packed their cars for the long drive across state lines, Cross was already executing the physical phase of our ambush. He did not just rent the room under my name. He rented the rooms on either side and the one directly across the desolate hallway. Working through the night, his private security team transformed that dingy motel room into a high-definition digital fortress. They installed pinhole 4K cameras inside the plastic smoke detectors behind the television screen and embedded within the cheap lampshades. They rigged the room with omnidirectional microphones, sensitive enough to pick up a nervous whisper from the bathroom. Every single square inch of that cheap motel room was monitored and wired directly to a secure server, uploading the footage to the cloud in real time. I did not travel to Kentucky. I remained comfortably seated in my coastal sanctuary, safe behind my locked biometric gates and armed security guards. I opened my laptop on the glass dining table, connecting directly to the live surveillance feeds Cross had established. I watched the grainy footage of the empty motel room, noting the hideous floral bedspread and the flickering neon vacancy sign buzzing outside the dirty window. I poured myself a cup of dark coffee and settled into my chair. The tactical patience I had mastered in the corporate boardroom was now being deployed against my own flesh and blood. I watched the digital screen for hours, waiting for the inevitable arrival of the predators I had raised. I expected them to be angry. I expected them to threaten the empty room, to scream in frustration, to violently demand that I sign the papers saving Matthew from federal prison. I was entirely prepared to witness their verbal abuse, but nothing could have prepared me for the sickening depths of their actual malice. Shortly after 2 a.m, the live feed from the motel parking lot flickered to life. A dark sports utility vehicle pulled into the empty lot, parking recklessly across 2 faded white spaces. I leaned closer to the screen, watching as the heavy car doors swung open. Matthew stepped out first, looking disheveled, frantic, and aggressive. Bradley followed, his face locked in a cold, calculating grimace. But they were not alone. A third man stepped out of the back seat into the humid night air. He was older, wearing a stained, rumpled suit, and shifting nervously as he looked around the deserted parking lot. More terrifyingly, he was carrying a heavy, worn leather medical bag, clutched tightly in his shaking hands. My private investigator immediately ran the license plates of their vehicle and used facial recognition software on the unidentified third man. Cross called my secure phone less than a minute later, his voice heavy with a grim professional disgust. The third man was not a cheap lawyer or a family friend. He was a disgraced, unlicensed medical examiner whose medical credentials had been permanently revoked years ago for accepting bribes to falsify autopsy reports and fraudulent psychiatric holds. Bradley had not just come to yell at me or beg for a legal signature. He had actively hunted down the most corrupt, desperate phantom of the medical community he could find, paying him thousands of dollars under the table to cross state lines in the middle of the night. The sheer, horrifying magnitude of their plan crystallized in my mind with absolute clarity. They were not planning to persuade me to come home. They were not planning to trick me into getting into their car. They had brought a crooked doctor with a black medical bag to forcefully sedate me in a cheap motel room. Their objective was to physically overpower me, have the unlicensed doctor sign a fraudulent on-the-spot psychiatric evaluation, declaring me an immediate danger to myself, and essentially kidnap me under the guise of an extreme medical emergency. They intended to drag me back to Ohio, heavily medicated and chemically restrained, bypassing the entire judicial process they had already lost. They planned to lock me away in a dismal state-run psychiatric ward before I could ever speak to a legitimate authority or contact my own attorneys. I stared at the screen as my sons and their hired mercenary marched up the concrete exterior stairs toward the motel room door. The last fragile thread of my paternal sorrow completely snapped and was instantly replaced by an absolute freezing conviction. These men were not my children. They were violent, unhinged criminals completely willing to chemically restrain their own father to steal his lifetime of hard work. They thought they were walking into an isolated room to silence a weak, declining old man forever. They had absolutely no idea they were stepping directly onto a brilliantly lit stage, broadcasting their most heinous felonies in crystal-clear high definition directly to federal investigators. I took a slow, deep breath, watching the screen as Matthew raised his heavy boot to kick the motel door open completely, ready to witness the absolute and permanent destruction of my family. I watched the grainy feed on my computer screen as the dark vehicle idled in the parking lot of that dismal Kentucky motel. I had instructed Mitchell Cross to choose this specific decaying building for a very deliberate reason. Over a decade ago, before the property completely faded into roadside obscurity, this exact building hosted a much different event. It was the site of Matthew's rehearsal dinner. I had paid over $15,000 for that evening. Valerie had demanded something rustic yet upscale, and back then this place still possessed a certain manufactured charm. I remember walking into the dining room that night, feeling a profound sense of paternal pride. I had financed the entire celebration to ensure my son had a perfect start to his marriage. But when the seating arrangements were finalized, I found my name card placed at a tiny wobbly table in the very back wedged right next to the swinging kitchen doors. I spent the entire evening listening to waiters shout orders and the clatter of dirty dishes, completely isolated from the joyful toasts and laughter of the main family tables. They gladly took my money and literally pushed me into the shadows. Now, a decade later, I was using the exact same location to trap them in their own darkness. Through the live feed on my laptop, I watched Matthew rear back and kick the flimsy wooden door. The cheap lock splintered instantly, and the doorframe cracked under his desperate violence. He charged into the room like a rabid animal, followed closely by Bradley and the disgraced doctor, who was clutching his heavy leather medical bag. They fanned out like a tactical assault team, checking the cramped bathroom, ripping back the mildewed shower curtain, and tearing the floral bedspread off the mattress. They flipped over the mattress and kicked open the small closet doors, searching for a frightened old man. When they finally realized the room was completely empty, the adrenaline rapidly drained out of them, leaving nothing but pure, unfiltered rage. The performance of the deeply concerned sons vanished entirely. Matthew slammed his fist against the cheap wooden dresser, screaming vulgar curses that echoed crystal clear through the hidden omnidirectional microphones. Bradley paced the stained carpet floor like a caged predator, his pristine suit jacket discarded carelessly on the ground. Unaware they were starring in a 4K resolution broadcast, they began to loudly and clearly detail their entire criminal conspiracy. Matthew yelled that they were running out of time. He paced frantically, rubbing his face and complaining that the bank was actively preparing the federal fraud indictment for the forged commercial loan by Friday. Bradley shot back, his voice dripping with absolute venom, telling Matthew to calm down and stick to the plan. Standing right in front of the hidden camera embedded in the television bezel, Bradley explicitly stated their intentions. He mapped out exactly how the doctor would inject me with a heavy chemical sedative the moment they cornered me. They planned to forge my signature on the psychiatric hold documents, drag me unconscious across state lines, and lock me permanently in a bleak state-run psychiatric ward. Bradley literally outlined the financial liquidation on camera. He proudly stated they would use their fraudulent guardianship to drain the blind trusts, divide the $12 million equally, and pay off Matthew's impending criminal forgery charges before the federal authorities could even issue a warrant. It was agonizing to sit in my quiet coastal sanctuary and listen to the boys I had raised plot my permanent institutionalization. They spoke about my life as if I were a piece of defective machinery that simply needed to be dismantled for parts. The unlicensed doctor nervously interrupted their argument to ask about his payment, reminding them of the enormous risk he was taking by crossing state lines with sedatives. Matthew snarled directly into the hidden microphone, promising the doctor $50,000 in cash, directly from my estate, the very moment my assets were frozen. The audio was absolutely pristine. Every single syllable of extortion, kidnapping, and financial fraud was captured, uploaded, and secured by my private investigator in real time. We had everything we needed to bury my sons in a federal penitentiary for decades. The trap had worked flawlessly. But human error is a chaotic variable, and my highly trained private investigator had made one small, nearly catastrophic miscalculation during his preparation of the room. To make the motel room look authentically lived in Cross, had brought a handful of my forwarded mail from a secure postal box. He scattered a few junk mail envelopes and supermarket flyers on the cheap wooden desk to sell the illusion that I had been staying there. But among the generic credit card offers and local advertisements, Cross had accidentally dropped one real piece of mail. It was a forwarded utility bill for my secure coastal condominium. I watched through the camera feed as Matthew, panting heavily and leaning his weight against the desk, let his eyes wander over the scattered papers. He carelessly pushed aside a grocery flyer, and his gaze locked onto the white envelope. He picked up the utility bill, holding it up to the dim overhead light. I could see his brow furrowing as he read the printed address block. He read the zip code out loud. It was a zip code belonging to an exclusive gated coastal community located 1,000 miles away from that dismal Kentucky motel. The shift in the room that was immediate and absolutely terrifying. Matthew handed the paper to Bradley without saying a word. Bradley pulled out his phone, his thumbs frantically typing the zip code into a search engine. His eyes widened as the search results populated his screen. He looked up at Matthew and let out a cold, breathless laugh of pure predatory realization. He announced to his brother that the old man was not hiding in a filthy highway motel. He was sitting comfortably in a multi-million-dollar beachfront sanctuary. The flawless trap we had sprung was successful in gathering evidence, but the endgame had suddenly violently shifted. The brothers dropped the forged medical papers on the carpet, abandoning the disgraced doctor in the motel room without another word. The hunt was no longer a blind search through old tax records and false digital breadcrumbs. They had an exact geographic target. They knew the location of my sanctuary. The hidden cameras captured them, running back out to their dark vehicle. Their previous desperation entirely replaced by an absolute violent determination to drive south and break down my front door. When I fled Ohio, I did not just come to the coast to hide on a balcony and watch the ocean. I came here to finalize my true legacy. Over the past decade, while I was living like a frugal pensioner in the suburbs, I was quietly funneling millions of dollars into a massive construction project 1,000 miles away. It was a sprawling state-of-the-art community youth center built entirely in secret. It had an indoor Olympic-sized swimming pool, a massive gymnasium, a fully equipped computer lab, and free tutoring programs for at-risk children. I built it in the poorest district of this coastal county, completely transforming the neighborhood. But the most important part of the entire facility was the solid bronze plaque bolted to the front entrance. It read, "The Martha Gallagher Community Youth Center." I built it for her. Martha had always wanted to be a teacher, but she gave up her dreams to help me run the logistics company in its early days. She spent her life taking care of our boys, hoping they would grow into honorable men. When it became painfully clear that our sons had grown into greedy, entitled monsters, I decided her legacy would not be tied to them. Her legacy would be tied to the thousands of children who actually needed help, who would actually appreciate the resources given to them. I spent my afternoons walking through the bright, echoing halls of the center, listening to the sounds of children laughing and learning. It was the only place on earth where I felt completely connected to my late wife. I was standing in the grand atrium of the center, looking up at the glass skylight, when the heavy entrance doors violently swung open. The serene atmosphere of the building was instantly shattered by the loud, aggressive footsteps of two men who did not belong there. It was Matthew and Bradley. They looked absolutely unhinged. Their expensive, tailored suits were deeply wrinkled and stained with sweat from their frantic cross-country drive. Their eyes were bloodshot and darting wildly around the pristine lobby. They had not found my secure, gated condominium. Instead, they had likely bribed a local real estate agent or bullied a town clerk until they found the only massive commercial property recently registered under a corporate shell company associated with my wealth management firm. When they walked in and saw the massive bronze plaque bearing their mother's name, they did not look at it with awe or reverence. They looked at it with pure predatory calculation. They realized they had found the money. I did not run. I did not call for the security guards. I simply stood in the center of the atrium, with my hands clasped behind my back, and waited for them to approach. Matthew charged toward me, his face flushed bright red, with a terrifying mixture of exhaustion and absolute desperation. He was completely running out of time. The federal fraud investigators were closing in on him back in Ohio, and he was backed into a corner of his own making. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not apologize for the violent ambush they had planned at the motel. He completely bypassed any pretense of familial affection and launched directly into a brazen criminal extortion attempt. "Dad, you are going to listen to me, and you are going to listen to me right now." Matthew hissed, his voice echoing off the polished marble floors. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. "I know you have $12 million hidden away in these corporate trusts. I know you built this massive vanity project just to hide your cash from us. You are going to authorize a wire transfer of $500,000 into my personal account by noon today. If you do not authorize that transfer, the bank is turning my forged loan documents over to the federal prosecutor, and I am going to prison." I stared at him, my expression entirely blank. "And why would your impending prison sentence motivate me to hand you $500,000, Matthew?" I asked softly. "Because if you do not wire me that money right now, I am going to destroy this entire place," Matthew snarled, stepping so close I could smell the stale coffee and sheer panic on his breath. "I already have the number for the biggest investigative journalist in this state. If the money is not in my account by noon, I am calling the press and the federal authorities. I am going to tell them that this entire youth center is a massive illegal money laundering front. I am going to claim that you have been using fraudulent shell companies to evade millions in taxes and that you are using this charity to clean your dirty money. I will tie this entire facility up in endless federal litigation. I will have the doors padlocked by the end of the week, and I will personally make sure that Martha's name is dragged through the mud on every single news channel in the country. I will utterly destroy Mother's legacy." The silence in the atrium was absolute. Bradley stood a few feet behind Matthew, crossing his arms, with a smug, self-satisfied smirk on his face. They truly believed they had won. They honestly thought they had found the one vulnerability that would force me to surrender. They thought that by threatening to desecrate the memory of the woman I loved more than anything in this world, I would finally break and hand over my wealth. They assumed that my love for Martha was a weakness they could easily exploit, but they were fundamentally wrong. My love for Martha was not a weakness. It was the absolute source of my unyielding strength. I looked into the bloodshot, desperate eyes of my oldest son. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of fear or intimidation. Instead, I slowly reached into the inside pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out my encrypted mobile phone. I held the device up between us, the screen glowing brightly in the quiet lobby. "For the past 13 years, Matthew," I began, my voice dropping to a terrifying, freezing whisper, "I have secretly subsidized the lives of your children. While you and Valerie were drowning in credit card debt, to maintain your country club memberships and luxury leased vehicles, I established blind educational trusts for my grandchildren. Every single month for over a decade, I have quietly routed anonymous payments to cover their elite private school tuitions, their expensive extracurricular activities, and their upcoming university endowments. You believed you were successfully managing your finances, but you were actually surviving on my secret charity. I wanted to ensure that my grandchildren would not suffer for the sheer pathetic incompetence of their parents." Matthew's smug expression began to falter. The color slowly drained from his face as my words began to penetrate his panicked mind. Bradley uncrossed his arms, his posture instantly stiffening with sudden anxiety. I kept those accounts active even after I vanished. I continued, my thumb hovering deliberately over the glowing screen of my phone. I kept them active even after you forged my signature to steal from me. I kept them active even after you hired a disgraced doctor to violently sedate me in a motel room. I left that final tether intact because I foolishly believed that children should not be punished for the sins of their fathers. But today, standing in a building built to honor the mother you ignored, you looked me in the eye and threatened to destroy her memory, to save yourself from a prison cell you built with your own hands. You have proven to me that the rot in this family runs entirely too deep. "Dad, wait," Matthew stammered, taking a sudden step backward, his hands rising in a desperate, pleading gesture. I pressed the button on my screen. The digital command was instantly transmitted to Jonathan Pierce's secure servers. "There is no waiting, Matthew," I said, slipping the phone back into my pocket. "I just initiated a permanent, irrevocable financial kill switch. Those educational trusts have been completely liquidated as of this exact second. The funds have been permanently redirected into the operating budget of this youth center. Your children's private school tuitions will bounce tomorrow morning. The university endowments have been completely revoked. You have no savings. You have no assets. You have a massive fraudulent loan you cannot repay. and you just lost the only invisible safety net that was keeping your family from total, absolute poverty. I looked at the two men standing frozen in the lobby of my sanctuary. You did not just secure your own prison sentence, Matthew. You just bankrupted your own children. Long before the bespoke suits and the quiet corners of corporate boardrooms, my life was defined by the brutal, unforgiving rhythm of the shipping docks. In my 20s, I did not sit behind a polished mahogany desk, analyzing profit margins or delegating tasks. I hauled heavy wooden crates, I loaded freight onto rusted cargo ships in the dead of night, and I worked freezing midnight shifts where a single moment of distraction could cost a man his fingers or his life. The docks taught me a very specific kind of physical and mental endurance that money simply cannot buy. You learn to breathe through the biting cold. You learn to stand your ground and keep your footing when a heavy suspended load swings dangerously out of control. You learn an absolute unshakable calm that only comes from knowing your own physical limits and surviving them day after day. It was a rugged, calloused foundation that carried me through the fiercest corporate negotiations of my entire career. I built my logistics empire on that solid bedrock of blue-collar grit. My sons, however, inherited the empire without ever touching the dirt it was built upon. Matthew and Bradley grew up with manicured lawns, heated swimming pools, and the soft, insulated comfort of a life where the temperature was always perfectly regulated. Their hands had never blistered from a hard day's work. Their muscles had never ached from genuine labor. Their entire existence was built on soft, panic-driven entitlement. When faced with genuine adversity, men forged on the docks grow quiet and still. Men forged in country clubs simply lose their minds. That fundamental difference between us became violently apparent later that same night. I was sitting in the darkened living room of my coastal condominium, nursing a glass of sparkling water and watching the moonlight reflect off the crashing ocean waves. The absolute finality of severing my grandchildren's secret tuition funds had not brought me joy, but it had brought a necessary surgical closure to the illusion of my family. I knew Matthew was unraveling rapidly. The sudden evaporation of his invisible financial safety net, combined with his impending federal bank fraud charges, had pushed him past the absolute brink of rational thought. Driven to complete madness by the financial decapitation, he decided that physical intimidation was his only remaining tactic. Shortly before midnight, the heavy silence of my sanctuary was shattered by the shrill ringing of my secure intercom system. It was the front gate security detail. The head guard, a former military contractor named Davis, spoke with a tense, highly controlled urgency. He informed me that a man claiming to be my son was currently screaming at the perimeter gates, demanding immediate entry to the complex. Before I could even instruct Davis to contact local law enforcement, the audio on the intercom erupted into sheer, unadulterated chaos. Through the crackling speaker, I heard the heavy metallic thud of a vehicle ramming directly into the reinforced steel security barricade. Matthew, completely consumed by blind, desperate rage, had used his rental car as a literal battering ram. He was attempting to physically force his way into my highly secured residential complex. I listened as shattered glass rained down onto the pavement, followed by the terrifying sounds of a violent physical altercation. Matthew had climbed out of his wrecked vehicle and was actively attacking the security guards. I could hear him screaming my name into the humid night air, his voice cracking with hysterical, animalistic fury. He was demanding his money, demanding his inheritance, completely oblivious to the fact that he was committing multiple violent felonies in front of dozens of high-definition security cameras. He threw wild, uncoordinated punches at the trained guards, tearing at their uniforms, screaming that I was hiding inside and stealing his children's future. The guards, exhibiting incredible professional restraint, wrestled him to the concrete, pinning his arms behind his back, while he thrashed and wept like a spoiled, oversized child. The flashing red and blue lights of local police cruisers soon illuminated the perimeter, responding to the emergency panic alarms triggered by the guardhouse. I did not go down to the gates to intervene or offer comfort. I watched the entire pathetic, violent spectacle unfold from the secure, high-resolution feeds on my laptop. But as local law enforcement flooded the entrance and began arresting a bloodied, hyperventilating Matthew, I noticed a second figure standing just outside the harsh glow of the police sirens. It was Bradley. He had not participated in the physical assault. He had stayed a safe, cowardly distance away, completely avoiding the violence and the risk of arrest. Instead, he was holding his cell phone steady, carefully filming the immediate aftermath of his brother's spectacular breakdown. Bradley was always the manipulative mastermind, the opportunist who let others take the blunt force of the risk while he quietly harvested the reward. As the police officers pulled a handcuffed, sobbing Matthew to his feet, Bradley stepped forward out of the shadows, putting on the performance of a lifetime. He did not yell or act aggressively toward the responding officers. He spoke to the commanding police sergeant with a calm, deeply sorrowful voice, actively spinning a completely fabricated and highly malicious narrative right there on the sidewalk. Through the enhanced audio of the security feeds, I heard Bradley weave his poisonous web. He falsely claimed to the officers that I was a paranoid schizophrenic suffering from severe, untreated delusions who had recently fled medical care. He spun a tragic, compelling tale telling the police that his loving, desperate brother had simply tried to perform a wellness check on their sick, elderly father, only to be brutally assaulted by my overzealous security guards at my delusional behest. He painted Matthew not as a violent extortionist who had just rammed a gate with a car, but as a traumatized victim of an insane, wealthy man who had entirely lost touch with reality. The police, dealing with a chaotic late-night scene and a seemingly cooperative weeping family member, took Bradley's statement exactly as he delivered it. They drafted a preliminary incident report documenting a violent family dispute centered around an allegedly mentally unstable patriarch. They had absolutely no idea they were simply holding the pen for Bradley's next aggressive legal maneuver. Bradley was not trying to save Matthew from spending a night in a jail cell. He was looking at the bigger picture, looking at the $12 million sitting in my offshore trusts. He was deliberately using the violent public standoff and the resulting police report as the concrete foundation for his ultimate strike against my autonomy. The very next morning, armed with the officially documented police incident report and his carefully edited video footage framing the security guards as the aggressors, Bradley marched straight into the local family courthouse. He used the manufactured chaos of the previous night to file an emergency ex parte injunction. It is a terrifying legal mechanism designed to completely bypass standard judicial review and deny the accused any immediate right to defend themselves. Relying on the false police narrative of my supposed violent schizophrenia, Bradley demanded immediate total legal control over my life, my medical decisions, and my entire estate. He thought he had finally outsmarted the old man from the shipping docks. He thought he had trapped a ghost in a legal cage. He had no idea that I was already dressed, waiting for the sun to rise, and preparing to walk straight into his courtroom. Jonathan Pierce was never just a wealth management attorney. Before he entered the lucrative private sector, he spent 15 years acting as a ruthless federal prosecutor. His absolute specialty was dismantling the lives of arrogant white-collar criminals. He actively despised the kind of men who wore imported silk ties while committing massive fraud, and he hated the soft, entitled heirs who believed their biological bloodline placed them entirely above the law. When I first met Jonathan decades ago, I saw a man who wielded the legal code like a surgical scalpel. He did not care about social niceties or polite compromises. He cared about absolute, unyielding justice. That was exactly why I trusted him to build the complex legal walls around my logistics empire, and it was exactly why he was the perfect attack dog for this very morning. When I told Jonathan about Bradley using a violent police standoff to file an emergency ex parte injunction, I heard something terrifying resonate in his voice. It was the cold, hungry anticipation of a seasoned predator catching the scent of blood in the water. Jonathan viewed my sons not merely as greedy children, but as the exact breed of entitled parasites he had spent his entire federal career burying in concrete cells. He did not just want to defend me in family court. He wanted to completely and publicly annihilate them and make sure they never recovered. I woke up before dawn that morning feeling a profound sense of clarity. For 13 years, I had dressed like a forgotten pensioner, wearing faded sweaters and scuffed shoes. to maintain the illusion of a humble middle-class existence. I walked into my spacious walk-in closet and bypassed the casual coastal wear. Instead, I reached for a garment bag containing a pristine charcoal gray bespoke suit. It was tailored perfectly to my shoulders, a remnant of my corporate days that I had kept perfectly preserved. As I buttoned the crisp white shirt and adjusted the silk tie, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The vulnerable, lonely old man who had wept over a ruined birthday dinner was completely gone. Staring back at me was the ruthless corporate titan who had built a logistics empire through sheer force of will. I was putting on my armor. I was stepping back into the role of the man who never lost a negotiation and never surrendered to extortion. I left my condominium and met Jonathan Pierce in the lobby, where a black town car was waiting to drive us directly to the coastal county courthouse. I felt no fear. I felt only the freezing calm of a man executing a flawless tactical strike. We arrived at the courthouse and stood quietly in the marble hallway just outside the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. Through the thick wood, I could hear the muffled, pathetic performance happening inside. My family was putting on the theatrical show of a lifetime. Bradley stood before the family court judge, his voice trembling with perfectly manufactured sorrow. He spun a tragic, compelling tale of a beloved patriarch completely lost to the ravages of violent dementia. He presented his heavily edited video footage of Matthew fighting the security guards, twisting the narrative to claim that I was a paranoid schizophrenic who had ordered armed mercenaries to assault my own desperate, loving son. Sitting right behind the defense table, Valerie and Courtney were playing their parts flawlessly. They dabbed at their dry eyes with expensive tissues, sobbing quietly for the benefit of the sympathetic judge. They painted a picture of a family pushed to the absolute brink, terrified that their sick, wealthy father was being financially drained by unseen predators. They begged the judge to grant them immediate total legal guardianship to save my life. The judge, an older man who took elder abuse very seriously, listened to their weeping with genuine concern. He looked down at the fraudulent police reports and the falsified affidavits. He picked up his heavy gold pen, fully prepared to sign the emergency injunction. With one stroke of that pen, my sons would be granted absolute legal authority to freeze my trusts, liquidate my assets, and lock me inside a psychiatric ward forever. The pen hovered mere inches above the official parchment. That was the exact moment Jonathan Pierce nodded to the bailiff. The heavy, ornate wooden doors of the courtroom swung open with a loud, resounding crash that echoed like a gunshot against the high marble ceilings. The pathetic weeping symphony of my daughters-in-law instantly stopped. The judge looked up, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. I stepped through the doorway, and the entire atmosphere of the room shifted violently. I did not look like a wandering, senile old man who had lost his grip on reality. I walked down the center aisle with the heavy, measured footsteps of a corporate titan walking into a hostile boardroom takeover. Flanking me on my right was Jonathan Pierce holding a thick leather briefcase like a loaded weapon. Behind us marched a formidable wall of 4 highly aggressive litigation associates, dressed in identical dark suits, their expressions locked in terrifying professional silence. We moved as a single unstoppable force of absolute ruin. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead, but I could feel the sheer suffocating terror radiating from the defense table. Bradley physically recoiled, staggering backward until his spine hit the wooden railing. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw dropped open, but no sound came out of his throat. Courtney dropped her crumpled tissue, her fake tears drying up instantly as her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated panic. They had built their entire legal strategy on the arrogant assumption that I was hiding, that I was too terrified and confused to ever step foot inside a courtroom. They expected to fight a phantom. They never expected the phantom to kick down the front door and bring a federal attack dog with him. Matthew, who had been sitting quietly with a fake bandage wrapped around his wrist from the previous night's altercation, began to hyperventilate. He shrank down into his wooden chair, looking exactly like the cowardly, entitled child he had always been. The judge lowered his pen, staring at our formidable procession with absolute bewilderment. He demanded to know the meaning of this unprecedented interruption. Jonathan Pierce did not wait for permission to speak. He strode confidently past the wooden partition, placing his heavy briefcase directly onto the center podium, with a loud, definitive thud. His voice boomed through the quiet courtroom, carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who owned the room. He introduced himself as my lead legal counsel and firmly instructed the judge to put his pen down immediately. Jonathan declared that the entire petition sitting on the bench was a masterclass in perjury, orchestrated by desperate, bankrupt felons attempting to weaponize the judicial system for a massive financial heist. He spoke with a chilling, articulate fury that left the judge completely speechless. I stepped up to stand shoulder to shoulder with Jonathan. I looked directly at Bradley, who was currently trembling so violently that his knees were practically knocking together. I did not yell. I did not display a single ounce of the paranoia or confusion they had so desperately tried to brand me with. I simply stared at him with the cold, calculating gaze of a man who had finally trapped his prey. The fake tears, the dramatic sobbing, and the manipulative lies were completely over. The courtroom was dead silent, suffocated by the immense weight of the reality closing in around them. They realized in that freezing, terrible moment that they were not the predators in this scenario. They were simply the bait, and the jaws of the trap had just permanently snapped shut. Walking to the witness stand felt like walking across a battlefield. The heavy silence of the room pressed down on my shoulders. 13 years ago, I stood alone in the freezing rain over Martha's open grave. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and the cemetery was completely empty except for me. My sons had left the funeral early, claiming they had pressing business to attend to. I stood there shivering, looking down at the mahogany casket, and I made a silent, unbreakable vow. I promised Martha that I would fiercely protect her legacy. I promised that I would never allow anyone, not even the boys she carried, to disrespect her memory or the life we had built together. Stepping onto the polished wood of the witness stand today, looking out at the terrified faces of my sons, I knew I was finally fulfilling that sacred promise. I raised my right hand, swore to tell the whole truth, and sat down. I did not look like a man suffering from severe cognitive decline. I sat with a ramrod straight posture, my eyes locked directly onto the judge, radiating absolute freezing clarity. Jonathan Pierce approached the podium. He did not act like a typical family court attorney pleading for sympathy. He moved with the predatory grace of a federal prosecutor who had finally cornered a cartel boss. Pierce began his examination by asking me simple, direct questions about my logistics company, my financial trusts, and my recent real estate transactions. I answered each question with sharp, calculated precision, providing dates, exact financial figures, and complex corporate structures. With every coherent sentence that left my mouth, the narrative my family had spun completely disintegrated. The judge, an older man with sharp gray eyes, leaned forward over his heavy oak desk. The sympathetic, gentle expression he had worn while listening to Bradley weep earlier had completely vanished. He was beginning to realize that he had been brazenly lied to. But Pierce was not there to simply prove that my mind was sound. He was there to expose a massive criminal conspiracy. Pierce turned to the bailiff and requested permission to submit digital evidence to the court. A large television monitor was rolled out and positioned directly facing the judge's bench. The defense table erupted into a frantic panic. My son's cheap lawyer jumped to his feet, objecting wildly, claiming that they had not been provided discovery for any digital media. Pierce calmly reminded the court that in an emergency hearing regarding imminent physical harm, expedited evidence could be admitted at the judge's discretion. The judge overruled the objection with a sharp, impatient wave of his hand. Pierce pressed a button on a remote control, and the massive screen flickered to life. The high-definition footage of the squalid Kentucky motel room filled the quiet courtroom. The video began with the violent splintering crash of the motel door being kicked open. The entire courtroom flinched collectively as the audio echoed off the high marble walls. On the screen, Matthew charged into the frame like a rabid animal, followed closely by Bradley and the disheveled, unlicensed medical examiner carrying his heavy leather bag. The resolution was absolutely pristine, leaving no shadow for them to hide in. The judge watched in horrified silence as my sons tore the empty room apart. Then the undeniable audio began. Because of the omnidirectional microphones hidden by my private investigator, every single whisper, curse, and criminal confession was broadcasted with crystal-clear perfection. The courtroom listened to Matthew frantically discussing his impending federal indictment for the forged commercial bank loan. They listened to Bradley coldly, instructing the bribed doctor on exactly how to forcefully inject me with a heavy chemical sedative. Bradley mapped out the entire kidnapping plot, detailing how they would forge my signature on the psychiatric hold documents, drag me unconscious across state lines, and lock me in a bleak state-run psychiatric ward. The most devastating moment came when Bradley outlined the financial liquidation. His voice echoed through the courtroom, proudly stating that they would drain my blind trusts, divide the $12 million, and pay off Matthew's criminal debts before the authorities could issue a warrant. The raw, unfiltered malice on display was absolutely paralyzing. I shifted my gaze from the monitor to the defense table. The pathetic, weeping performance of my daughters-in-law had abruptly stopped. Valerie was sitting frozen, her face completely drained of blood, staring at the screen, as if she were watching a ghost. Courtney had her hands clamped over her mouth, visibly shaking, her manipulative confidence entirely shattered. The cheap lawyer representing my sons looked physically sick, realizing he had just tied his professional career to a pair of federal criminals who had lied to him. Matthew was staring blankly at the polished wooden table in front of him, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. Bradley looked like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. Pierce turned off the monitor, letting the silence hang heavily in the air. But he was not finished. He opened his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of certified financial documents. He approached the bench and handed the thick file directly to the judge. Pierce explained that the documents were verified bank records, proving unequivocally that Matthew had forged my signature to secure a $300,000 commercial line of credit. He then submitted digital communication logs, proving that Bradley was not only aware of the massive forgery, but was actively helping to cover it up by attempting to steal my estate. The web of lies, extortion, and fraud was now officially entered into the permanent court record. I watched the judge's face closely. The initial shock of the video evidence rapidly morphed into pure, terrifying judicial fury. His face turned a dark, angry shade of red. This was a man who dedicated his entire life to protecting vulnerable seniors in the family court system. He had almost been manipulated by crocodile tears into signing an order that would have handed my life over to violent, greedy predators. He looked down at the forged documents, then slowly raised his eyes to glare at the defense table. The air in the courtroom felt so incredibly dense it was hard to breathe. The judge did not speak immediately. He just stared at my sons with a look of absolute, unadulterated disgust. In that suffocating silence, the reality of the situation finally crashed down on Matthew. He was not going to get a temporary guardianship order today. He was not going to get his hands on my $12 million. The federal prison sentence was no longer a distant, abstract threat looming over his head. It was an immediate, inescapable reality that was waiting for him the second he stepped out of the courthouse. His entire life, his country club memberships, his luxury cars, his carefully curated social status were completely gone. The padded room of entitlement that had protected him his entire life had finally vanished, leaving him completely exposed to the brutal consequences of his own actions. The crushing weight of absolute ruin broke him. His arrogant golden boy persona shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The realization that he had lost everything, that his father had utterly outsmarted him, triggered a primal, violent reaction. Matthew let out a sudden guttural scream that sounded less like a man and more like a wounded, cornered beast. Before the bailiffs could react, before his own lawyer could grab his arm, Matthew snapped. He vaulted over the heavy wooden defense table, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. He did not run toward the courtroom doors to escape. He lunged directly across the aisle, his hands outstretched like claws, launching his entire massive body straight toward the witness stand where I sat. He was coming directly for me. The distance between the defense table and the witness stand was perhaps 15 feet. But in that moment, time seemed to stretch and dilate into a surreal, slow-motion crawl. Matthew launched his massive frame across the polished mahogany partition, his face contorted into a mask of absolute feral desperation. His hands were outstretched, and his fingers curled like claws aiming directly for my throat. A younger father, or a softer man, might have flinched or raised his arms to protect himself. But I did not move a single muscle. I sat perfectly still in the heavy wooden chair, watching the golden child of our family reduce himself to a rabid animal. I knew he would never reach me. Before Matthew could even clear the central aisle, the courtroom erupted into explosive physical action. 3 armed bailiffs who had been watching the tension escalate from the perimeter converged on him with terrifying speed. The largest officer tackled Matthew mid-stride, burying a heavy shoulder directly into my son's ribcage. The impact sounded like a car crash, echoing violently off the high marble walls. Matthew hit the polished hardwood floor with a sickening thud, the breath knocked entirely out of his lungs. The bailiffs instantly pinned him down, burying their knees into his back and violently twisting his arms behind him. He thrashed and kicked, screaming incoherent obscenities and pressing his face against the cold floor. I looked down at the boy I had raised, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged and whose college tuition I had paid in full. Watching him gasp for air under the weight of law enforcement, I felt a profound philosophical clarity wash over me. For my entire life, I believed that protecting my children from failure was the ultimate duty of a father. But looking at Matthew writhing on the ground, I finally understood the true nature of justice. True justice is not merely winning a lawsuit or securing a favorable verdict from a judge. True justice is the absolute removal of the invisible safety net. It is stepping aside and allowing greedy, entitled people to face the natural, crushing weight of their own disastrous choices without anyone there to catch them. For 35 years, I had been the mattress placed beneath the windows they kept jumping out of. I absorbed the impact of their mistakes, their debts, and their arrogant miscalculations. They believed they were invincible because they never had to feel the concrete hitting their bones. Today, the mattress was gone. Today, the concrete was rising up to meet them, and the impact was going to shatter their lives into pieces that could never be glued back together. I realized sitting there that I had done them a profound disservice by protecting them from hardship. Hardship is the only forge that builds a man of substance. By removing every obstacle from their path, I had accidentally bred weak, cowardly men who believed the world owed them a living. Watching Matthew pressed against the floor, struggling under the weight of 3 grown men, I felt the last lingering threads of paternal guilt evaporate from my soul. I owed them absolutely nothing. The judge was standing behind his elevated bench, his face purple with absolute incandescent rage. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel down repeatedly, the sharp cracking sound cutting through Matthew's pathetic screaming. He bellowed for order in his court, his voice trembling with a judicial fury that sent chills through the entire room. He pointed a shaking finger directly at the officers pinning my son to the floor and ordered them to detain that man immediately. He commanded them to place Matthew under arrest for assault within a courtroom and direct contempt of court. The judge then turned his blazing eyes toward the court stenographer, commanding her to ensure every single word was captured on the official record. He announced that he was formally referring Matthew to the federal prosecutor's office for immediate investigation regarding the forged commercial bank loans and massive financial fraud revealed during my testimony. The judge made it explicitly clear that Matthew would not be leaving the building through the front doors today. Matthew began to sob uncontrollably as the cold steel handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The metallic sound echoed with a brilliant finality. But the judge was not finished. He turned his devastating attention toward Bradley, who was still cowering behind the defense table, completely paralyzed by fear. He addressed Bradley with a voice dripping with absolute disgust, stating that his actions were some of the most reprehensible violations of familial trust he had witnessed in his entire career on the bench. The judge formally declared that the emergency petition for guardianship was officially dismissed with extreme prejudice, ensuring it could never be filed in his jurisdiction again. He then looked directly at the court bailiffs and ordered them to escort Bradley out of the building, announcing that he was referring Bradley to the district attorney for active criminal conspiracy and felony elder abuse. Bradley physically collapsed. His legs gave out completely, and he slumped back into his wooden chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. The manipulative mastermind, the quiet opportunist who always let others take the risk, was finally drowning in the tidal wave he had helped create. Their cheap attorney began frantically packing his briefcase, refusing to look at his clients, and abandoning a sinking ship to save his own miserable career. Jonathan Pierce stood beside me, his posture immaculate, and a faint, grim smile playing on his lips. The federal attack dog had delivered exactly what he promised, which was total public annihilation. I stood up from the witness stand, straightening my suit jacket perfectly untouched and perfectly composed. The bailiffs hauled Matthew to his feet, dragging him roughly toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. I walked slowly down the center aisle, following the chaotic procession out into the bright public corridor. I wanted to witness the final collapse of their perfectly curated illusions. The wide marble hallway outside the courtroom was crowded with spectators, lawyers, and security personnel. As the bailiffs pushed Matthew through the double doors, the grand facade of his marriage instantly and spectacularly shattered. Valerie, who had sprinted out of the courtroom moments before the physical altercation, saw her husband emerging in handcuffs. The woman who obsessed over country club memberships and imported luxury vehicles completely lost her mind. She did not run to comfort him. She did not ask if he was hurt. She lunged forward, her face twisted in pure, venomous hatred, and began screaming at him in front of dozens of strangers. She shrieked that he had ruined everything and called him a stupid, arrogant fool, her voice echoing shrilly down the corridor. She screamed that she was losing her house, her cars, and that her friends were going to see this on the evening news. She slapped her expensive designer handbag against his chest, completely ignoring the police officers who tried to push her back. She cried out that he had sworn this was going to work and that they were getting the money. She announced that she was calling her divorce attorney the second she got to her car, promising to take the children and leave him to rot in a federal cell. Matthew begged her to stop crying, pathetic tears, and begging her to stand by him, but Valerie turned her back on him, marching down the hallway with her high heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor, leaving her husband to face prison entirely alone. Courtney emerged from the courtroom moments later, trailing behind a devastated, sobbing Bradley. Unlike Valerie, Courtney did not scream. She was far too calculating to throw a public tantrum. She was a master manipulator, rapidly assessing a completely ruined chessboard. She looked at her husband, shivering and weeping against the corridor wall, a man who was now facing state conspiracy charges and total financial ruin. Courtney did not offer him a single word of comfort. She stepped away from him, distancing herself, as if he carried a contagious disease. She looked him up and down with an expression of cold, absolute disdain. She announced clearly across the quiet hallway that she was not going down for this disaster. She claimed she had absolutely nothing to do with that fake doctor or that cheap motel room, insisting this was entirely his and his idiot brother's idea. She smoothed her modest sweater and declared loudly enough for the lingering court officials to hear that she was driving straight to family court to file for divorce and separate her personal finances from his criminal liabilities. She threw him under the bus without a single second of hesitation, actively preparing to offer state prosecutors whatever information they needed in exchange for her own immunity. Bradley fell to his knees on the cold floor, weeping uncontrollably and begging her not to abandon him. I stood quietly near the heavy oak doors, watching the so-called perfect family tear itself apart like a pack of starving wolves fighting over a scrap of meat. There was no loyalty, there was no love, and there was absolutely no honor. The moment the promise of unearned wealth evaporated, they immediately turned their fangs on each other. The masks of the devoted sons and the grieving daughters-in-law were completely gone, replaced by desperate feral criminals trying to save their own skin. I felt a deep, profound peace settling into my chest. The cancer had finally been surgically removed from my life. They were facing the absolute ruin they had spent 13 years building for themselves, and I did not feel a single drop of pity. I just watched them burn. The heavy glass doors of the courthouse closed behind me, shutting out the chaotic noise of the hallway. The sudden quiet of the exterior stone steps felt like waking up from a long, suffocating fever dream. I walked down the wide granite staircase toward the blinding afternoon sun, with Jonathan Pierce remaining a respectful distance behind me. With every step I took away from that building, my mind searched for the familiar heavy anchor of paternal guilt that had dragged me down for over a decade. I waited for the crushing sorrow that a father is supposed to feel when he watches his children destroy their own lives. I waited for the nagging voice in the back of my head, whispering that I should have done more to save them. But that voice never came. The anchor was completely gone. For years I had tortured myself with the belief that I had fundamentally failed as a parent. I thought that my long hours building the logistics company had created an emotional distance that ruined my boys. I believed that my absence during their formative years had somehow broken their moral compasses. But as the warm sunlight hit my face, I experienced a profound and liberating epiphany. I did not fail by neglecting them. I failed by succeeding entirely too well. I had built a financial fortress so impenetrable and provided a life so incredibly comfortable that it completely insulated them from reality. I had shielded them from the hunger, the freezing cold, and the brutal physical exhaustion that had forged my own character on the shipping docks. I wanted to give them a perfect life completely devoid of suffering. I did not understand that suffering is the exact mechanism that teaches a human being empathy and resilience. By removing every single struggle from their path, I had accidentally bred monsters. I had raised soft, entitled parasites who viewed unconditional love as a weakness and generosity as an invitation for exploitation. Understanding this fundamental truth lifted the final burden from my soul. My job as their father was officially and permanently finished. There were no more lessons to teach and no more safety nets to provide. I reached the bottom of the courthouse steps and walked toward the sprawling concrete parking lot where a sleek black town car was waiting with the engine quietly idling. The air was thick with the humid heat of the coastal afternoon. I simply wanted to get into the back seat, return to my quiet sanctuary, and watch the ocean waves erase the memory of this wretched day. But the final act of this tragedy required one last, desperate performance. I heard the frantic slapping of leather dress shoes hitting the hot pavement rapidly approaching from behind. I stopped and turned slowly. It was Bradley. He had managed to break away from the courthouse security perimeter and was sprinting across the parking lot toward me. The quiet, calculating opportunist who always kept his hands clean was completely unrecognizable. His expensive tailored suit was rumpled and stained with sweat. His tie hung loosely around his neck like a broken noose. His face was blotchy red and streaming with panicked tears. He was hyperventilating, gasping for air as he closed the distance between us. Jonathan Pierce immediately stepped forward to intercept him, raising a hand to signal my private security detail waiting near the vehicle. I gently placed my hand on Jonathan's shoulder, stopping him. I wanted to hear exactly what my youngest son had to say in his absolute darkest hour. I wanted to see if rock bottom could finally produce a single ounce of genuine human remorse. Bradley did not stop at a respectful distance. He completely abandoned whatever fragile shreds of dignity he had left. He collapsed directly onto the scorching black asphalt right at my feet. He fell to his knees, scraping his expensive trousers against the rough gravel. He reached out with shaking hands and actually grabbed the fabric of my pant leg, clutching it like a drowning man holding onto a piece of driftwood. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, his face contorted in a mask of pure, pathetic agony. "Dad, please, you have to listen to me," Bradley sobbed, his voice cracking and breaking under the weight of his total ruin. "You have to help me. Courtney left me. She took the cars, she drained our joint checking accounts, and she locked me out of the townhouse. The district attorney is drafting the conspiracy charges right now. They are going to arrest me by the end of the week. I am going to lose my business, and I am going to go to a state penitentiary. You have to save me." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping man, clutching my shoes. I waited for the apology. I waited for him to beg for forgiveness for conspiring to drug me, drag me across state lines, and lock me in a psychiatric ward. I waited for him to show just a fraction of sorrow for treating me like a disposable asset. But the apology never came. Even now, completely ruined and facing years in a prison cell, Bradley could not see me as a human being. He only saw a bank vault. "I just need a loan, Dad," Bradley pleaded wildly, squeezing my leg tighter. "I just need you to wire me $200,000 so I can hire a criminal defense attorney. I know you have the $12 million in the offshore trusts. I saw the bank statements. $200,000 is nothing to you. It is spare change. You can afford it. Just give me the money to keep me out of a prison cell, and I swear I will pay you back. I will do whatever you want. Please just write the check." He was bargaining for his freedom, using the exact same fortune he had planned to steal by destroying my mind. The sheer blinding audacity of his request was almost mesmerizing. He was kneeling on the hot concrete, begging the man he tried to institutionalize to finance his legal defense. I looked down into his desperate, tear-filled eyes. I did not feel a single surge of anger. I did not feel the fiery, righteous indignation that had fueled my actions over the past few weeks. I did not even feel pity. I felt an absolute freezing emptiness. I looked at him as if he were a complete stranger, begging for loose change on a street corner. "I died 13 years ago on my birthday," I said, my voice perfectly flat and carrying the quiet, devastating weight of absolute finality. "You just forgot to attend the funeral." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. Bradley's eyes widened in sheer horror as the profound meaning of my statement finally penetrated his panicked mind. He released his grip on my pant leg, his hands falling limply to the hot asphalt. The realization washed over his face, twisting his features into a picture of absolute despair. He finally understood that there was no hidden reserve of paternal forgiveness waiting to rescue him. There was no secret bank account that would suddenly unlock to pay for his mistakes. The father who had loved him unconditionally, the father who had worked brutal midnight shifts on the shipping docks to buy his first bicycle, the father who had waited alone in a house filled with an untouched birthday feast, was completely and permanently gone. I had buried that naive, forgiving man a long time ago. I did not offer him another word. I simply turned my back on him. I walked the remaining few feet to the waiting town car. The driver had the heavy armored door held open for me. I stepped into the cool leather interior of the back seat, settling into the quiet luxury of the vehicle. Jonathan Pierce slid into the seat beside me, giving the driver a brief, silent nod. The driver slammed the heavy door shut, sealing us inside the quiet, soundproof cabin. Through the tinted, reinforced glass, I watched Bradley screaming my name on the concrete. He was pounding his fists against the scorching pavement, wailing in a display of total, catastrophic ruin. The car smoothly shifted into gear and pulled away from the courthouse, leaving him kneeling in the dust. I watched his pathetic, shrinking figure slowly disappear as we merged onto the main road. I did not look back again. I faced forward, feeling the gentle hum of the engine and the cool air conditioning against my skin. I had completely and irrevocably cut them out of my universe forever. The heavy, suffocating chains of toxic obligation were entirely shattered. For the first time in 70 years, I was entirely, fiercely, and beautifully free. The flight back to the coast felt entirely different from the drive I took 6 months ago. Back then, I was a man fleeing from a broken heart, carrying the heavy, suffocating weight of paternal failure. Today, as the commercial jet touched down and I finally returned to my secure coastal sanctuary, I felt lighter than air. Walking through the front door of my condominium, the familiar scent of sea salt and polished wood greeted me like an old friend. I poured myself a simple glass of iced water, walked out onto the sunlit balcony, and listened to the rhythmic, soothing crash of the ocean waves. Looking out at the vast, endless horizon, my mind drifted away from the chaotic marble hallways of the courthouse. I found myself thinking about the very beginning, long before the multi-million-dollar trusts, the corporate buyouts, and the offshore accounts. I thought about the first apartment Martha and I ever rented together. It was a tiny, drafty walk-up with peeling wallpaper and a radiator that clanked loudly in the dead of winter. We possessed absolutely nothing of financial value. I was working brutal double shifts on the shipping docks, coming home with grease under my fingernails and an aching back. Martha was working as a receptionist, saving every spare quarter in a cracked ceramic jar on our tiny kitchen counter. We ate cheap canned soup for dinner and drank instant coffee, but we were incredibly fiercely happy. We had each other, we had our unyielding ambition, and we had absolute unbreakable trust. I realized sitting there with the warm coastal sun on my face that the immense fortune I eventually built was never the actual prize. The true wealth of my life was the quiet, humble peace we shared in that freezing little apartment built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine love. Over the next few months, the inevitable crushing gears of the justice system ground my son's arrogant illusions into fine dust. I did not attend any of the subsequent hearings, nor did I answer any of the pathetic pleading letters forwarded by their desperate public defenders. I simply read the sterile, objective legal updates provided by Jonathan Pierce. Matthew, stripped of his expensive lawyers and his golden boy persona, was forced to face the sheer terrifying reality of federal court. The bank fraud investigators, armed with the undeniable evidence of the forged commercial loan, showed absolutely no mercy. Without my invisible financial safety net to catch his fall, Matthew was sentenced to 5 years in a federal penitentiary. The judge explicitly cited his egregious attempt to weaponize the family court system as a factor in the severe sentencing. The man who once obsessed over country club tea times and tailored suits was now wearing a state-issued uniform, completely isolated from the luxurious world he thought he was entitled to. His days of demanding the finest cuts of meat were replaced by the rigid, unforgiving schedule of a prison cell block. Bradley did not fare any better. The quiet, calculating mastermind who thought he could outsmart everyone was utterly destroyed in civil and bankruptcy court. With the district attorney pursuing him for felony conspiracy, his fragile carpentry business instantly collapsed. Creditors swarmed his remaining assets like vultures. The court ordered a complete, absolute liquidation of his company, seizing his equipment, his commercial leases, and his personal bank accounts to satisfy the mountain of debt he had accumulated. The man who had sneered at hard labor, believing he was destined to inherit millions without lifting a finger, was left with absolutely nothing. He was forced to move into a cheap, dilapidated rental property, taking a minimum wage job just to survive, ironically experiencing the exact kind of poverty he had always mocked. His manipulative mind was entirely useless against the cold, hard numbers of a court-ordered liquidation. The poetic justice delivered to my former daughters-in-law was perhaps the most satisfying element of the entire ordeal. Valerie and Courtney, the women who had weaponized my beloved Martha's death for social media sympathy and spearheaded the vicious smear campaign against my sanity, were left entirely to drown in the shallow, materialistic oceans they had created. When the truth of the federal fraud and the fabricated psychiatric hold became public knowledge, their carefully curated social circles instantly and violently rejected them. The country club memberships were revoked. The elite private schools expelled their children due to unpaid tuitions. Valerie, who had proudly announced her divorce in the courthouse hallway, quickly discovered that divorcing a convicted federal felon does not magically erase shared marital debt. The banks repossessed her luxury leased vehicles and foreclosed on the sprawling suburban home she had so desperately tried to defend. She was forced to pack her designer clothes into garbage bags and move back in with her aging parents, completely humiliated and socially exiled. Courtney, the master manipulator, found herself trapped in an identical nightmare. Her attempts to offer state prosecutors information in exchange for immunity failed miserably, as the authorities already possessed all the evidence they needed from my private investigators' recordings. Without Bradley's income and completely cut off from the secret tuition funds I had previously provided, she was buried under a mountain of insurmountable debt. The credit card companies sued her for the massive balances she had racked up trying to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth. The women who had once looked at my simple, outdated sweaters with pure, unfiltered disgust were now working exhausting retail jobs, struggling to keep the lights on, and finally learning the brutal, unforgiving cost of living beyond their means. Their perfect digital lives had been reduced to ashes. With the toxic, parasitic elements of my past completely and permanently eradicated, I was finally free to secure my true legacy. I invited Jonathan Pierce to my coastal condominium for one final, monumental meeting. We sat at the glass dining table overlooking the shimmering ocean, a stack of heavily vetted legal documents resting between us. I took a gold pen from my breast pocket and systematically signed away my entire $12 million fortune. I did not leave a single penny to the bloodline that had so deeply betrayed me. Instead, I irrevocably transferred every single asset, every offshore trust, and every piece of commercial real estate directly into the operational endowment of the Martha Gallagher Community Youth Center. As my pen glided across the final signature line, I felt an overwhelming surge of profound, beautiful purpose. The immense wealth that my sons had tried to steal, the money that had corrupted their souls and driven them to madness, was now permanently locked away to serve those who truly needed it. Countless at-risk children from forgotten neighborhoods would receive free tutoring, hot meals, and safe places to grow. Teenagers who had nothing would be granted full college scholarships, learning the exact values of hard work and resilience that my own sons had foolishly squandered. Martha's name would forever be associated with hope, generosity, and genuine love, completely untouched by the greed of the men who had forgotten her. Jonathan Pierce gathered the signed documents, shook my hand with deep, unspoken respect, and left me alone in my sanctuary. I walked back out onto the balcony as the late afternoon sun began its slow, majestic descent toward the horizon. The sky was painted in breathtaking shades of deep violet, burning crimson, and brilliant gold. The coastal wind swept over me, carrying the fresh, clean scent of the sea. I thought about the long, painful journey that had brought me to this exact moment. I thought about the untouched birthday dinner, the quiet escape, the terrifying motel ambush, and the final crushing victory in the courtroom. I had survived it all. I took a deep, cleansing breath, feeling the air fill my lungs without a single trace of sorrow, guilt, or regret. The heavy, suffocating chains of the past were completely gone. I sat down in my comfortable chair, watching the brilliant ocean sunset, finally free, entirely at peace, and absolutely victorious. The most profound lesson from Will's journey is that shielding our loved ones from every hardship does not protect them. It ruins them. True character is forged in the fires of struggle, resilience, and accountability. By providing a life of endless comfort and removing the natural safety net of consequences, we risk breeding entitlement, cowardice, and unyielding greed. Authentic love is not about giving someone everything they want, but equipping them with the moral compass to earn what they need. Sometimes the most compassionate and necessary act a parent can perform is to step aside and let their children face the crushing, transformative weight of their own choices. If Will's journey to reclaim his peace and stand up to a toxic family resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more empowering stories of justice and resilience.